On my work in junior high schools touches me a great deal. I often wondered why I left teaching in junior high school, and the only thing I ever could account it to is the fact that I had a GI Bill, and I had already had my master's degree, and thought I ought to use something that the government was giving me. So I came to Ohio State. But I really enjoyed teaching in junior high schools. I never, at the time, had very much inclination to want to get into a high school, as I understand one of the problems of teaching, one of the staff problems in junior high school seems to be. So I was thinking a great deal about that as Dr. Clore drove me down this morning from the north part of Columbus. What I would like to do today is to share some observations with you about junior high schools that strike me as making sense to me. I'd like to recall some of the circumstances that have placed focus on the junior high schools, and then, if we have time, to make some rather hasty suggestions about what we might do about these problems. I don't know how true this story is, but the historians of the 18th century France tell us that after the publication of Emile, there was a renewed interest in childhood. Rousseau had touched off a whole series of cultural patterns, so to speak, in which the ladies of nobility decided to rear their own children instead of putting them out to governesses. Ladies' styles were affected by this renewed interest in childhood, and probably some aspects of psychology and philosophy of childhood education were affected by this interest. I think today that with adolescence we have a similar kind of phenomenon. If we're looking now to some of the reasons why there's a real interest in the junior high school, and I would cite, first of all, this very noticeable interest in adolescence. I actually don't think that any of the Saigon novels or Chocolates for Breakfast, Pamela Moore's little novel about 15-year-olds, quite fits the bill of a meal, but there is a great deal of interest in modern writing and playwriting, and among adults generally, in the whole area of adolescence. I don't know, it may be a kind of a psychological identification of adults with the rebellion that adolescents seem to be making. But just in the past 10 years, you recall Carson McCullers' Member of the Wedding, in which the little girl tried so hard to grow up and even pulled her hair to make it grow longer and this sort of thing. Perhaps Holden Caulfield is a symbol of all 16 or 17-year-old young boys, and I think a whole host of plays like Dark at the Top of the Stair, West Side Story, probably some more, Tea and Sympathy, that you can think of that have focused from the professional writing field on the period of adolescence. Now, the junior high school being the new kind of institution, which for many parents is new to their experience, is then the symbol of this kind of interest. And with all this discussion of adolescence on Broadway and in the novels, the discussion of the adolescent market that Life magazine has played up so many times in the past 2 or 3 years. You've seen whole pages of the kinds of things that adolescents buy. We have a new interest in this particular age group, and with the junior high school symbolizing a new kind of institution set up to work with them. I think with this group, since it's a workshop group, you probably have studied pretty closely the growth of high schools, but that phenomenon too is striking. When you think of 1920, about 6% of all secondary schools being reorganized into some kind of a differentiation between junior and senior high school. About 1950, the number being equal. percentage-wise. And then here last year in 1960, the figure being set something like 75 or 80%. This is a phenomenal growth, and when things like that happen so rapidly, it's not surprising that there would be a great deal of attention given to the junior high schools. Another phenomenon that has brought this, of course, to our attention, and why we have junior high school workshops and a lot of interest in the colleges, is the rather recent emphasis upon specialization in education. I'll have a little more to say later about the fact that the junior high school has carried along a long tradition of uniqueness, and to some degree it's been insulated against curriculum change. But with the post-Sputnik interest in developing specialization, the whole of secondary education is coming under scrutiny in terms of goals and purposes and this sort of thing. And the junior high school offers a good fertile ground for that kind of inspection. I suppose the best examples of this are seen in the work that a number of special committees of scholars in such fields as mathematics and science and foreign language, in the work of those committees. The math people recently have published a little brochure in which they point out that there are about 5 levels of training for math teaching, and the second level, they speak of the elementary, and they speak of the second level as incorporating all the way from 7th to 10th grade. Now, I think many of you would recognize that the preparation for teaching algebra and geometry, or at least in most of our traditional backgrounds, has been a 9th grade or 10th grade kind of experience. But this group is emphasizing the special problems of teacher preparation for what they call level 2, 7 to 10. And, I had promised someone that I wouldn't say anything about Jerome Bruner, but I suppose this book is a very good example of this renewed interest in specialism. At least some aspects of it are. And the junior high school years are ones that are appropriate to this. And then finally, I would suggest that, and this is an admission of what colleges and universities do in the way of lagging, there has been on the campuses an interest in junior high schools stemming from a number of factors. For one thing, schools like the Ohio State University and our institution are called on from time to time to help staffs in newly formed junior high schools to develop curricula and work out problems. And through this kind of contact, and with the rather continuous harassment by principals like many of you for good teachers, finally the colleges of education and the teachers' colleges are beginning to ask some questions about teacher education for this particular institution. Well, those are 3 or 4 things that probably obvious to you that have shifted attention to the junior high school. I'd like to turn now to what I would call some observations of mine. You might call them theses about the present state of the art of dealing with adolescents in the junior high school. If I weren't in Ohio State country, I would like to call these misconceptions, but I think Harold Alberti has a bit of a copyright on the use of the term misconception, but in a sense you might interpret these observations that I'm making as what I would see as misconceptions of the role of the junior high school in the educational pattern. But I'll try to refrain from using his particular term there. The first thesis that I'd like to develop with you goes along something like this: that the junior high school suffers from the emphasis that is given to the adolescent culture as separate from the adult culture. Now, I think I'll try to spell that out. You have seen in the literature, and it's very much in the popular press, that here's a culture that represents a subculture within a larger pattern with values, language, aspirations quite distinct and in most cases quite contrary to the mainstream of American life. I'd like to read just one statement from a sociologist at Temple University that probably expresses this as well as anyone. When society does not clearly define the roles of adolescence, the teenager develops a subculture which carefully and clearly delineates his world from that of the adult. He develops a subculture that is different from the adults and strives to maintain the difference. When parents and teachers say that they cannot understand the teenager, the adolescent is not disturbed, but rather pleased that he has attained self-defined status, different from the crazy adult world given him by parents and teachers. He has been successful in creating a place for himself in society. And I don't think that represents probably the most scholarly statement of this issue, but you'll find it also in the sociological journals. And my thesis is that we are probably giving too much emphasis to this. And it's supported by a lot of popular tracts on adolescence today. Paul Goodman, the man who wrote Growing Up Absurd, some of you may know this little book, has a similar kind of thesis. He says that the reason we have this adult subculture is that the adolescent is fed up with the system that has created the organization man, and he, unlike most of us who fit into the pattern and become other-directed and become organization men, the adolescent is still able to rebel, so he does so. And this kind of thesis is supported by pointing to such cultures, subcultures, as the beatnik culture and the delinquent gang culture. Probably those are not the best examples for our use here, because I'm sure most of you would agree with me that the vast numbers of young people with whom you work don't quite fit into these patterns. However, Goodman suggests that basically the whole rebellion pattern of adolescence fits into this kind of a thesis. I'm suggesting this analysis here for the reason that it seems to me we're getting a little too much of it, particularly in the popular press and in some respectable educational and sociological journals. Another approach to this, and seems to me a little more fruitful, is one taken by Herb Thielen, and I don't know whether this is original with Thielen or not, but he takes the view that the adolescent really is not developing a counterculture, but he's trying to identify with adults, but the only adults with whom he can identify are the immature ones, the immature adults of Hollywood, of TV, the many-time married TV stars, the disc jockeys, the Clark, what's the man's name? Dick Clark, and these people. And the adolescent not only finds it easy to emulate this kind of adult, an immature adult, but also has the added advantage of pointing to the fact that these people have been successful money-wise, and that there really is some payoff to being an adolescent. So it may be that Thielen's thesis here might be a little more appropriate. And then I think one of the speakers you had here in your forum would be fruitful, Kenneth Benny, in some of his ideas of making the use of this fraternity or culture of adolescence, or the peer group. My point being here is that we don't need to look at one side of this analysis. There are many people who reject the thesis that there is a distinct subculture. Now, the obvious danger that I would see in this is that we might either take two directions. If we admit that there's a separate subculture and that the adolescents are quite different and try to develop a distinct school, the junior high school for it, we could reinforce the patterns that we are already complaining about. I think this happens sometimes in junior high schools. At least I'm speaking now. Probably it doesn't happen in your schools, but it happened in the one I was teaching in. It was an easy pattern to invite in the disc jockey, for example, to run the sock hop. And we talk about the patterns that the adolescent picks up from this immature adult culture, and if we're not careful by emphasizing the fact that this is a different culture, we may succumb to the old idea that if you can't lick them, you join them. And then the junior high school then becomes an institution for perpetuating this immaturity. Or it could turn the other direction and become a very countervailing institution, and in that sense fail to pick up some of the real problems of acculturation, of helping these young people move into adulthood, which most of them want to do. Well, that's one thesis I think it's worthy to look at as we try to improve the junior high school. The second thesis that I would like to develop with you is that the junior high school suffers from too much emphasis upon the uniqueness of the institution. This is a very common theme, and I think if some of you attended the leadership conference in the junior high school up at Cleveland last fall, you may remember that there was a great deal of emphasis on this. It's true that the junior high school, unlike the American Common School and the American high school, senior high school, developed out of a different kind of background. Both the elementary school and the American high school developed out of cultural conditions, and as V.T. Thayer points out in his review of the role of schools in the social order, junior high school is the only institution where its source for direction comes from the nature, the psychological nature and the biological nature of its clientele. You may say, well, a school ought to be developed out of, out of this. But it seems to me that as far as trying to articulate schools into a common pattern, the other schools grew out of cultural needs, and this one seems to grow out of something quite the opposite. And it does have then a history that causes it to be unique. I'm not sure if we ought to perpetuate this uniqueness, and I'd like to develop this point a bit. One of the things that you see getting into this uniqueness is the fact that the curriculum of the junior high school, particularly grades 7 and 8, has been a kind of a marking time curriculum. There are several areas of the curriculum, particularly mathematics, in which in the past grades 7 and 8 have really seen no development of any new concepts, but merely an application of things learned in the first 6 grades. To large degree, science is developed this way. And languages, of course, have not been emphasized a great deal in these grades. I hope I don't offend any of you who have a strong affinity toward guidance, but it seems to me that the junior high school has the relationship of guidance programs to them has emphasized this uniqueness of this particular school, and it has its consequences in a curriculum that often has these courses in personal adjustment and orientation, and courses that carry little relationship to the wider curricular content of the junior high school, but really have been developed by guidance people. Many of the school systems where I've had the opportunity to work with the junior high school program, it seems that one of the main avenues of interest was to develop a personal adjustment course in the grades 7, 8, or particularly 9. And we often found it was difficult to do anything with a broad general education once these kinds of courses got into the curriculum. Another evidence of this uniqueness that people emphasize is in the area of staffing for junior high schools. it comes down to this quite often, is that if you're looking for a good teacher, you ask the question, well, does he understand adolescence? Now, admittedly, this is a pretty good criterion, one criterion for a teacher at this level, but we long ago gave up the idea that an elementary teacher, all she needed to have was a love for children. It seems to me that teaching involves much more than this. These are important, but all of us can think of people whom we know understand or like adolescents or like children, and we wouldn't trust them to being teachers of our children. So there's a danger I see in talking about the uniqueness of this as an institution. Major danger is that it fails to articulate with the rest of the school program, and you have a kind of a middle school. I notice that one of your speakers are going to speak on the topic of the middle school. There's another danger here, too, that probably ought to be mentioned, is that with the guidance and counseling emphasis taking hold at this level, there seems to me at least, now I could be challenged on this and you want to discuss it, a little forcing of decision making, particularly in vocational fields. I feel that the junior high school youngsters are a little too young to be forced to make some of the vocational decisions that they're being made, and for lack of having a program that ties into the full continuum of education, and a program and the emphasis on it being a unique school where you have these kids are kind of in an adjustment period, I think we do the program harm by emphasizing that. Let me turn to thesis number 3, and it is related to the foregoing one. It is that the junior high school suffers from false assumptions about the nature of the elementary school and of the high school. There's a great deal made of the role of the junior high school as an articulating institution between these two functions. One of the speakers at the Leadership Conference on Junior High Schools up at Cleveland last year had this to say, as this I'm quoting from Clayton Buell of Philadelphia. This is in the report that you probably, I think you have here as part of your resources, Educational Research Council, Greater Cleveland. The elementary school is child-centered. The senior high school is subject-centered. The junior high school must articulate between them so that pupils will be at home in senior high school. This is a rather simple kind of formulation, and it would be nice if it were that simple, but my thesis here is that it's too simple a formulation, and I'm not sure if I read some of the things that are being done in way of research about the high school, whether it's true of the high school or whether the same assumption is true of the elementary school, and I'd like to speak a bit to that point. One of the very provocative studies that come out recently from a research grant under the Cooperative Research Program of the Office of Education has been Jim Coleman's study of 10 high schools in the Chicago area. He was interested in the value patterns of these young people in these high schools, and developed rather extensive questionnaires given to students and to principals and parents particularly, and the outcome of it, and it's quite an extensive study, but one of the major outcomes is that the major values of high school students seem to be shaped more by the extracurriculum. For example, and we'll use just one item from it, he asks these young people in high school, the boys, if you could be an outstanding athlete or a good scholar or something else, which would you like to do? And the evidence from these schools suggests that the interscholastic athletic complex and the values of being an athlete far surpass being a student, being a scholar, anything else in it. With the girls, the pattern is shifted just a little bit. The highest priority value with them is being pleasing and attractive to the athletes. And when these other factors come in of whether you'd like to be a good student or whether you'd like to, would your parents be proud of you if you were elected to lab assistant for the science class or something like this, it shows up very much. My point in using the Coleman studies suggests that maybe some of our assumptions about the senior high school have been false, is that really it's true they have a rather rigid curriculum sometimes as we look at it, but its main impact is not academic, and many of the smart students do a pretty good job of trying to deny that there's anything academic about it. And my point here is that this easy analysis that everything is serious in senior high school and that elementary school is some kind of a play situation is a faulty one. And if you tried to build a junior high school program trying to amalgamate these kinds of tendencies, you'd fail. For one thing, in this analysis that Buell makes, if you have a subject-centered high school and a child-centered elementary school, you're trying to mix, in a sense, two different kinds of things anyway. No wonder if you're operating in that premise that you might go mad in the junior high school trying to articulate between two programs. My point here is that probably the analysis, this kind of analysis, is a faulty one, and if indeed the elementary school and the high school schools are like this, then we ought to be doing something about the total system to improve it, to bring more unity to the program. I ran across a report the other day that suggested that, at least for some secondary people, they thought that the elementary school was pretty much subject-centered. Down in Winston-Salem, North Carolina, they've had a core program for about 4 years, and Bob Haynes there sent me a report, an evaluation of it, and the whole report emphasized the fact that no longer in 7th grade do the kids have this subject-centered self-contained classroom, that now they are in an integrated core program. And it was rather interesting to me that the whole burden of this report was to prove that integration at the junior high level was pretty good because the kids in 5th and 6th grade had a rather subject-centered curriculum. Well, I cite that only as another example that this kind of an assumption is a faulty one. My fourth thesis, and this is the last one, that the junior high school suffers from a lack of a clear concept of the role of general and special interest education. I think this will tie into some of the things that you've already heard here and we'll hear tomorrow from this rostrum. The thesis is made this way, that even though we've generally said the elementary school is given over to general education and the secondary school is specialized, we haven't really achieved this. And I don't propose to go a great deal into this kind of analysis. I think you here are having a common experience with me, who have witnessed and experienced the point of view of the Ohio State University and the impact of this university school, enough to recognize that general education leaves much to be desired throughout the school program, and special interest education leaves much to be desired, and probably the improvement would lie in looking at these. One of the factors in the problem is that in some ways junior high schools perpetuate a dualism between vocational education and academic education, which in many people's minds is a false dualism and should have been discarded a long time ago. I think sometimes Mr. Conant helps to perpetuate this. First of all, in his high school report, the tracking kind of thing, his emphasis upon the different kinds of curricula, and then in the junior high school one, his whole disregard of some of the curricular problems of general education. It's true he proposes a block of time in grade 7 and 8 in which the same teacher might teach English and social studies, but this is really not a curriculum proposal. I think really again it stems out of more of an interest in guidance. Probably the guidance people have had more of an impact on junior high schools than curriculum people in the past decade, and I think certainly they've influenced Mr. Conan to make these kinds of proposals. The whole emphasis upon ability grouping suggests that we haven't really considered general education at this level. Ability grouping seems to me to be more pronounced at this level than any other, and I suppose here in Ohio you run into all the interest among principals and teachers of streaming and grouping and laning. Around Fort Wayne it's all laning, and you can get more interest and discussion on this than almost any kind of a problem. The practical arts as a part of the special interest program are rather vocationally oriented. The kind of thing that you would see here or upstairs here in this building where the arts would be related to general education and be an exploratory kind of thing, you don't see in too many junior high schools. There's a great deal of almost professionalism that gets into these areas, and what we probably ought to be doing is taking a look not only at the junior high school but the elementary school and senior high school as well, and trying to define the specific roles of these two types of education. Well, I'm going to stop with those theses. I'd like just in closing to suggest 3 or 4 avenues of direction that might improve the schools. I'm sure you're working here 3 weeks on it. You come up with a whole host of recommendations. How do you say the last 2 days for recommendations, Ted? These relate basically to some of the assumptions that we've already made here in this analysis. First of all, I would ask that we put a little damper on this business of talking about the adolescent as some kind of a learner apart from all others. We wouldn't recognize ethnic groups or racial groups or religious groups as offering a good example for setting up a special school for teaching these. It seems unreasonable to assume that we ought to be talking about the early adolescent as being so different and so out of the mainstream of life to call for an institution that is so unique and also to perpetuate the kind of values that are developing. I would think there would be more help in, let's say, Kenneth Benny's analysis of peer groups, or Ralph Linton's analysis as an anthropologist of the lack of role and status of adolescents. I think the problem ought to be attacked from the larger American culture, and yes, recognize the particular strains that an adolescent faces as he becomes into this culture, but forget about talking about a separate, distinct culture that is a subculture in this respect. It would seem to me that this might be more fruitful avenue when we're talking about the adolescents. A second suggestion would be to speak less about this being a unique institution. Perhaps it is a middle school, but it ought to be part of a total educational program. And while there are probably some differences in instructional patterns and emphases, it seems to me that we're doing wrong to talk about it being so unique. Now, I hope I don't antagonize on this point, because this seems to be one of the issues that so many workshop groups in junior high schools seem to emphasize, that this is a totally different school from anything else. My point here is that I don't think it ought to be so totally different from the rest. It ought to relate to a common point of view in education in terms of goals and organization and procedures, recognizing, of course, that you have growing people and that they're different, and there would be some differences in that respect. In articulating with the elementary school and the secondary school, we may have to think again about the grade distribution. I suspect it is not the most significant whether you have 8, 7, 8, and 9 or whatever it is together, but there may be some help in getting ninth grade back into secondary education, where indeed it's been most of the time anyway, even though it's in a junior high school. And possibly considering a sixth grade organization. One of the things that impressed me very much about the White House Conference on Children and Youth last year was that the preponderance of studies by pediatricians and doctors and anthropologists suggesting that with our affluent society and a high caloric diet that our youngsters have, is that there is a great deal of precociousness among students, and that young people are maturing earlier. They're heavier, they're larger than they are. I mean, all the studies seem to show this. So it may be that the sixth grade might be considered. I would place that as a tentative kind of thing. Probably some of the ideas that Margaret Mead offers in respect to this situation would be helpful. She suggests that the elementary school be one of common education, and that we look on secondary education as one where a person can continue a certain kind of education any time in life. She feels that the emphasis that a person has to get through secondary school all at one time probably is a wrong emphasis. She points out that the labor laws of our country were developed back in the time when children were exploited in mines and factories and this sort of thing, and that probably this operates to exclude young people from many of the serious concerns of life. And so we might consider some different kind of articulation with these schools. Finally, I would suggest that we work toward the improvement of the whole curricular program along lines that have been emphasized in this workshop, and I'm sure Harold Alberti will emphasize tomorrow when he develops a defensible theory of organization of the curriculum. After all, there isn't really, we make much about this being a unique institution, but with the exception of a few block time programs, which are not very integrated, most of them that I see, we haven't done very much curricular-wise with the junior high school. It's been a kind of a stalemate in many respects, and probably men like Bruner and the people working in these various disciplines have been right to criticize the fact that the 7th and 8th grade particularly have been rather wasted years. Well, I haven't said a word about television or any of the technology. I'm always interested in the fact that if you start talking about these kinds of things, they would apply equally well at all levels of education. I am disturbed that so many people who are interested in particularly television see it as an instrument of general education. This is kind of an obvious one, at least in a college where you have required courses and you have large enrollments in these required courses. It seems obvious to many people that this is what you would put in television. I think probably if we really clarified our concepts of general and special interest education, we might find that much of this technology lends itself more to special interest education than to general. And we ought to be careful about missing some of the real values of a good general education that probably calls for the more intimate kind of teaching relationship. Thank you very much.
If this hasn't stimulated some thought and some questions, then we can't stimulate thought and questions here. So I would say we have some time on the clock, and please, now's a good chance to get Vic to react to whatever questions you might have. Go ahead.
One question, I was positive whether I heard correctly or not.
I was referring to something that Margaret Mead has written, at least one place was in the Harvard Business Review, and I think elsewhere I heard her speak along this line that part of the problem of this isolation of the teenage group or culture, if you're going to call it that, is that they have been removed from many of the serious concerns of living that obtained, let's say, 50 years ago. And child labor laws are a factor in it. And her point is that probably with safety devices and this type of thing, that we may be denying young people work opportunities on the grounds that, well, on the basis of labor laws developed a long time ago.
Vic, are you saying, I don't know how to ask my question, maybe without drawing a picture, but assuming that this represents sort of the way a school district is built, and if this represents, let's say, the first 6 grades, and this might be a 3-and-3 organization, that perhaps what you are advocating is a school, rather than an elementary school, a junior high school, and a senior high school, admitting that some places, or every place, all along the line, there are some uniquenesses, but that maybe we ought to even throw out the whole concept of junior high school, senior high school, and talk about schools?
I don't think there's much chance to do that. I think personally I would favor the kind of unified school that you have here. But this is not the situation. We have 80% of our secondary schools have this kind of, about this kind of organization, and it would be folly, I think, to suggest that you move to this kind of pattern. My point is that I wouldn't make so many speeches about it being so unique and different. I think it ought to be there ought to be some continuity in it.
You should fill in some lines.
Now, I can understand that there's a real concern among teachers in junior high schools, and I share this, is that being a new member of the educational fraternity, you're sensitive of having the goals of our practices of elementary schools and those of the high school thrust on. I can be sensitive. It seems to me, though, the problem is to look at the total educational pattern.
Would you tend to say then that we should do away with the grade organization in order to attain this total educational pattern?
Well, where schools have these non-graded programs, the kind of thing we're talking about might be a little more readily achieved. I don't know any junior high schools that have a non-graded program. I know people who proposed it. Maybe you have grades in these grades here in university school this way, Bill. I don't know. You have quite a bit of flexibility of in the total school.
No, I don't. I think we try to do some things together in the 7th and 8th grade.
If the curriculum of the junior high is not based on the nature and needs of the early adolescent, what is it based on and what should it be?
Well, when you use the term needs, I think we might be seeing this problem the same way. If the needs are derived both from the nature, and you use the term nature, but both from the nature and from the cultural milieu which the adolescent grows up in, I think I would agree. I'd say that's what it ought to be done. My point in my discussion here is that the program of the junior high school has tended to be one-sided. We've drawn a little too much from the nature of the organism, and probably not enough from the cultural context. And if you would want to define the needs of a person as being derived both from the nature of the individual and the nature of the society, then this is the point I'm trying to make. I'm a little fearful of when you try to develop a program entirely upon the psychobiological aspects of 2 or 3 years, is that you may miss the cultural relationship of the school program.
Well, would you go along with this then? That the content, the curriculum, should be based or be derived from the cultural needs of society, the ultimate needs of that individual when he becomes an adult, but that the method and the organization is based on the biological, psychological requirements.
I think that kind of analysis might get you into a box. I'd rather see the organization of curriculum based upon a concept of needs that derives from both sources. Did you get the point he was making? He was saying that should the curriculum, the structure of the curriculum, be derived from cultural analysis, but that the method of teaching be derived from a psychological analysis. That's it. I suppose there's this tendency to think of it as being this way, but I think it might lead you to a dualism that would make you uncomfortable. Go ahead.
I take it you're familiar with what the work of the Cleveland Educational Research Council.
Excuse me, I
take it that you are familiar with the work that the Educational Research Council is doing in Cleveland?
We have one of our staff members working with them, and I've learned a little bit from him, and I've seen this document on the, here it is, this document on the junior high schools.
I was curious, on the mathematical end, if there's been enough data in your mind to make a judgment whether or not we're moving in the right way, or right direction in this group. In other words, the emphasis seems to be moving algebra out of the 9th grade into the 8th grade, and in a whole sense, moving this math situation, many of the things that have been taught in 9th, 10th grade particularly, right on down even into the elementary grade. For example, teaching some geometry, even in 1st grade, 2nd grade, 3rd grade. Simple enough, true, but nevertheless being taught.
Well, I have a reaction to this. I think this is similar to, I suppose, what Bruner is proposing, that you try to get these concepts and structures down at any level where people are ready to deal with them. And I have no quarrel with that. I feel sometimes, though, that in the name of doing this, we bring specialism into the general program to a degree that isn't desirable. If we recognize this as special interest education for some people, maybe some bright kids who want to learn algebra in the 8th grade, fine, but to start thinking about it as a general program, it seems to me less desirable. One of the very common expressions that's made by people talking in this vein is that you have to get the student to think like a mathematician, to think like a scientist. Isn't that it? And that's why you need to develop these processes at this level. Well, I'm not sure if this would be the major function at, let's say, the elementary level, to get people thinking like a mathematician or scientist. Seems to me this is a rather specialized kind of emphasis that might well fit at the point where a person becomes a scientist, goes in training for it. And also, one might challenge whether or not the thinking of the scientist is much different from the thinking of the artist. You have a whole repertory of studies and reports from people at this institution that suggest that the artist and the scientist is not too much apart, or the snow, you know, what's the little book by Bronowski called Science and Human Values or something, where this point is made again and again, is that the thinking of the scientist isn't too different from the creative artist, you see. Both are creative in a sense. And so I have a little difficulty warming up to all of this talk about the thing to do in the elementary school is to make kids start thinking like scientists and mathematicians, this sort of thing. I probably will invoke all kinds of criticism from some of my colleagues here on this. I don't know.
I wondered if we could hear you speak a little bit more on this guidance in the junior high school. For example, in the area that I am working, we're headed more in the direction of 7th grade counselors, full-time 8th grade counselors, 9th grade counselors, and not teaching. Well, maybe they might be involved in some group work, but it's mostly full-time. I just wanted to get some of your reactions.
Well, this of course idea isn't certainly new for me. New to me. Many people feel that there has been a dichotomy set up between guidance and curriculum. You see the point that here you have a rather academic, sometimes sterile kind of a program, and then parallel to it you have a whole counseling and guidance structure. And the more emphasis you put to guidance and counseling, the less meaningful the experiences in the academic program. And it would seem to me that a good theory of junior high schools or any schools would be to try to avoid these dualisms as far as possible. Now, I'm not suggesting that you might not need specialized people in these areas, but I would be cautious personally of perpetuating this dualism. And I had some very strong feelings about the curricular aspects of it. A number of schools have tried to set up core programs, and they tried to set them up with a homeroom over here of about 20 minutes in which they did some kind of group guidance, and they had a course called Personal Problems or Personal Living or Orientation, which everybody took. And then they tried to develop some kind of an integrated core program, and it seemed to me that much of this is what Harold Alberti used to call curriculum tinkering. Instead of looking at the whole of the junior high program and trying to reorganize secondary or general education along some lines that he probably talk about tomorrow, we've tinkered a little bit with this. Now whether the guidance people are wholly guilty on that score, I'll leave it up to you.
I was real interested, Vic, in your remark that, yes, maybe because I concur about 1,000%, that one of our major problems is clarifying the conceptions of general education and specialized education. Would you care to throw out any ideas that you think somebody might want to pursue in attempting this clarification?
Well, I think one that's very commonly overlooked, and it's related to this problem of specialism, is that it seems to me we talk about general education meeting common needs, and we get a required curriculum, and if we have a core program, we have kind of a structure here. There's a second point to general education that probably we ought to recognize, that it has some responsibility for developing a specialized interest and needs up to a point of technical competency. This is a point that Mr. Alberti makes so clearly. And I think sometimes we miss this in our general education programs. The general education program is responsible for certainly common values, knowledge, skills, but it also has some responsibility for the unique, the particular kind of thing. At least nurturing it to the point where the special interest program could take over and do something with it. Now, it's in this area of doing something with these specialized interests that I think a lot of our general education program falls down. And this suggests that there probably have to be more flexibility to it. This suggests that the time block is fairly important for getting some things done that you can't do in a limited time. It also suggests that you have to have some criteria for making sure that you don't try to do the specialized work in the general education program. That you recognize where the point of technical competency is and then to work with it. That's one suggestion. I think another suggestion that grows out of the question, Ted, is that you've seen people draw lines, at least at the junior high school and senior high, and try to show how much ought to be required and elective, how much ought to be general and special. It would seem to me that the elementary school might have more special interest education than it now has. More opportunities to try out specialized interests. And if you were looking to the senior high school, that it probably ought to do a little better job with its general education program. I mean, if you were looking to two areas that might be worked on at these other two levels in relationship to the junior high school, it seems to me the elementary school probably does a better job with general education and probably needs something to do, some improvement of the special interest area, and the reverse situation in the senior high school. I'm surprised no one's asked about athletics in junior high school. Do you have had that problem in here?
When Dr. Matthews was here from the physical education department, we explored this at some length, and I think there's some people who are going to explore it perhaps even further. So I'm sure that a lot of the questions on this have already been on the table.
We have a practice in Indiana. I don't know whether you do it here. You believe more in football than you do basketball. But a bright kid, if he has some athletic ability, quite often is kept back a year. He's de-accelerated, I guess you'd call it, so that he gets a little taller, and by the time he gets to be junior or senior, he's about 6'5" or 6, and they call it posting. I talked with a coach about this one time, and he was very sincere in saying he thought it was really a pretty good thing, because actually a lot of these kids wouldn't get to go to college if they didn't get an athletic scholarship, so we keep them back a couple of years to do this. I don't know, maybe maybe it has some advantages. You don't post athletes in Ohio, do you? In order to win tournaments?
We don't talk about it.
You import them, right? Yes, sir.
Are you saying that you keep them at the 7th and 8th grade level? At the same token, how do you know which one is going to be that kid that's going to develop?
Well, this is something we didn't say about the junior high school, but one of the misconceived roles of it, if we were going to talk about misconceptions of roles, is that it's a feeder system for the athletic program and the band program. Now, isn't it true that that some of the major emphases seem to indicate this? And we're just now, and this is probably why we're fighting the academicians, that they want to make it the feeder system for the science program and the math program. And I suppose if we let it be the feeder system for athletics, we shouldn't kick too much if the scientists want to use the junior high as a feeder system.
Dr. Lougheed, I think that this is an outgrowth of the practice of redshirting in the university.
Redshirting, that's a new one.
That means that if you get more material, if you get more material than you need that year, he wears a red shirt, and he's distributing some practices in these various sports, but he doesn't compete. And then he's more available, he can be used better next year. And so he goes on with his subjects, but he doesn't use up that year of eligibility. I think there's a distinct connection between that. Because in subsidization processes, many, especially I'm familiar with a city system that they before they will accept anyone under the ground on the proposition that he's going to be a potential athlete at this university or college, they even play him in semi-pro or industrial to retard his progress for a year. And I think that that has drifted down. I think it's drifted down to that extent.
Our institution hasn't developed any reputation in the athletic field to the extent where it's gotten to be a real problem, but I suppose it could in time.
Would you feel, Vic, that a junior high school teacher